Well, hello everyone. My name is Kevin and I'm the Discipleship Director here at Faith Covenant. Welcome to our podcast. Today we are doing our fifth and final, for now, episode on mental health. And maybe we'll do some more down the road at some point. But for now we're doing 5 episodes and we're ending with this episode today. And today I'm once again joined, like last week, by Lisa Wold. She is a counselor at Bethel University in the student services. I don't know what department it is.
Yeah, it's under student life.
Sure. So she does that. And one of her other passion areas is trauma. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be digging into that today because trauma affects all kinds of things. It affects pre-existing mental health diagnoses. It creates new ones. It does lots that I'm not equipped to talk about it, which is why you're here. So thank you again, Lisa, for being here. Yes. And so let's just kind of start out by talking a little bit about what trauma is, because it's a very big word. It encompasses a lot of things, and we can't even specifically dial in on every single piece of it.
No, an hour or however long we talk this time will not be enough.
Yep.
But I think it's good to at least get some information out there about it, because it is something that's impacting a lot of people. So
One of the ways you talked about trauma in our previous conversation is that it's a normal response to an abnormal event.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you take away nothing else from this conversation, that's one of the pieces I would want you to take away. Because what happens, so it's helpful to identify that trauma is actually our response to events. Events are not trauma. Trauma is our response to the event. Does that make sense? So
an event is traumatic.
Yeah, an event can be traumatic, but trauma is actually how the changes that happen to us as a result of experiencing that event. So I'll often use the term like a trauma-producing event, but trauma responses for us are basically just things that happen both in the moment and sometimes even afterwards to help us cope with these trauma-producing events. And often what I'm looking for when it comes to a trauma-producing event is that it was unexpected. There was nothing that you could do about it as the person who's experiencing the event. And it overwhelmed your abilities to cope. Mm-hmm. So you hit kind of that trifecta of things, and often that can lead to some symptoms of trauma. And I'm saying that very carefully because I think a lot of times when we hear the word trauma, we think immediately PTSD, which we will get into, but not everyone with trauma symptoms has PTSD.
Mm-hmm. And PTSD is obviously a very big part of a lot of conversations, especially in the last 5 to 10, 15 years, just because it's like been featured so much more in like television and film. And it's been like, you've seen PTSD in film and stuff, but it's maybe not been named explicitly until in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and it really came out of understanding what was happening. I mean, especially PTSD, understanding PTSD in particular, came out of understanding what's going on with our veterans as they're coming back. Because they're having these symptoms. Again, we talked last week about how when you are dealing with something with mental health, it's often a cluster of symptoms. And so all of these men start coming back with a certain cluster of symptoms. And it's like, okay, what's going on here? We need to figure this out.
Sure. And so one of the things that we talked about is that there can kind of be something that's like what you call big T trauma and little t trauma. What's kind of the difference there?
Yeah. So a lot of times, especially when you get into the DSM, and I know Anna talked about that, that's like the big diagnostic manual that we all kind of look at, but big T trauma are the things you probably think about when you hear the word trauma, such as like, they're big, overwhelming events that often threaten life and limb or your emotional well-being. So whether that's, a traumatic accident or
like a car accident.
War, a tragic death, like all those things we would call big T traumas. But there can be things where either, we talked about this, there can be an accumulation of sort of events that are traumatic, that do overwhelm our coping abilities, that can be traumas, or there can be things that to me, because of my personality, my background, my experiences, all of that have impact me in a traumatic way that may not necessarily impact you.
Right. And so That's important to know, that what's trauma for one person may not be trauma for another.
Yes. Yeah, because there's a lot that has to, trauma is often in the eye of the beholder in that sense of like, you know, how I'm coping, how I'm impacted by an event can look very different than how you are. And again, that's not a judgment call at all.
Right.
Our backgrounds can play into that. Our support systems that we have around us can play into that. You know, have we experienced previous traumas like this before? Like all of that can play into how we experience a traumatic event.
So two people could be in the same car, get in an accident, and, you know, maybe their physical level of injury or non-injury is the same.
Yep.
But in terms of mental health, they could have two completely different responses where one person doesn't manifest any trauma symptoms and the other does.
Yeah, absolutely. And car accidents are a great example because they happen to so many of us, and so you know, and I think it's a great example too because it shows kind of like you said, two people can be in the same thing, and we've often had that, or maybe you weren't the driver, so it impacted you in a different way, or you'd been in a car accident before, so now you were a little bit more jittery trying to get back into a car. I mean, all those things could play into how you experience that event. The other thing that I like about car accidents is because, again, we're most familiar with them, is that you'll kind of notice, like, you don't have to have any kind of full-blown PTSD to notice sort of symptoms that you've experienced something. So, for instance, for those of you who might recognize, like, I've been hit before, and whenever someone comes too quickly in that same direction towards my car, you kind of have that little body response, and that's a really normal symptom of trauma. The thing about it is that trauma symptoms can feel overwhelming if you have enough of them. And that's why I like to go back to that. Trauma symptoms are normal responses to abnormal events. The event is the thing that was not normal. Your body trying to cope with that, it's doing it in a very normal way, but it can feel like a lot when you're experiencing it.
And something too with the little t trauma that we talked about previously is that this can be a cumulative thing where each of the incidents on their own may not do much to you, but cumulatively they create a trauma response. So like, I think of myself, this maybe wasn't quite trauma for me, but like I was in a toxic workplace for some time, and like each of the things that were examples of the toxicity there weren't necessarily trauma-inducing on their own. But over time, when another thing happened, it was just like, ugh! And so that's kind of how little t trauma can kind of develop. Another example you'd use was like abuse.
Where you can, if you experience, if you're in a relationship, let's say that's abusive, whether that's parent-child or a dating relationship or something like that, as those situations continue to go on and you start to feel more and more maybe powerless, or you experience some of these reactions happening more commonly, that's going to lead to some symptoms of trauma over time. And God made us in an amazing way in that we can kind of, we have our trauma symptoms also sort of help us manage in the moment, but we can go through certain events and recover pretty quickly. But if it happens too often, if it keeps happening, things like that, it starts to wear in our reserves. And so we don't have as much to bring to the table then when it happens again.
So we talked about a couple of examples previously about things that are traumatic, either collectively or individually. Like the Great Depression was, probably traumatic for a lot of people who lived through that. And like, I know we both related that we had grandparents who lived during that time, and today, or in later years, they would maybe like hoard food or just like save food for a long time because you never know when you're going to need something. And
or
that's
save
maybe
like
kind of a
plastic
response
containers,
to it. It's like
the Cool Whip jar things.
Like when my mom was moving her mom down to Arizona last year, they found like cake mix that was expired like 15 years ago. It's like, okay, this can be thrown away. And my grandma's like, no, we can't throw anything away. And that's kind of, in some ways, a trauma response. We could also talk about COVID and how COVID has affected all of us in some way. And even if you're not necessarily economically impacted, or if you haven't known someone who's passed away from it, it's been a traumatic time. No matter where you fall on the spectrum of vaccines or masks or anything, like,
absolutely,
there's a lot to unpack with what we've been going through in the last couple years.
And when you look at the COVID pandemic, was it unexpected? Yep. Was there anything we could do about it for most lay people? Nope. Did it overwhelm, us, especially in the early days when we had no idea what was going on and we're just told to go home and wait it out?
And good luck with toilet paper.
And good luck with toilet paper. So it hits all the categories that you kind of look at. And so, it's very likely that for many people, they could at least have, notice some symptoms, even if they, again, don't even qualify for a full diagnosis of anything.
So then like more specific individual circumstances about trauma can be like we talked about already with like car accidents or an unexpected death in the family, or even an expected death, like if they've been battling a disease for a long time, that still can be traumatic. And so I'm going to share one example in my life of a traumatic event, a singular event, and then that'll kind of just give us an example to look at as we talk about some of the immediate trauma responses as it's happening, and then some further symptoms. So this is a true story, and I'm going to not include any names or identifying info, but a couple of years ago, actually just before the pandemic, long story, but I was concerned about a friend, and I went to check on them, and I found them shortly after they'd made a suicide attempt. And so I had to call 911. It was with alcohol and pills, and so I had to call 911 and get them there. I had to call this person's adult child to be like, your parent just attempted suicide. And then I was at the hospital for the overnight and for the next day. And throughout that time, I was having to kind of manage my own symptoms, which we'll kind of talk about in a moment. But also I was trying to be there for the adult child that I also had a close relationship with. And so there were just a lot of moving pieces, and I think it's just helpful for us in our conversation to have an example like that to kind of talk through, like, okay, yes, that was happening or wasn't happening. Because it's different for everybody. Like, you may have some of these trauma responses, but not others. So
absolutely.
So I'm just sharing that example just to kind of, as kind of a thing to kind of look at, so we can kind of see what happened in my experience. So then as trauma is happening, so this is usually a specific event, whether it's not necessarily a long-term trauma situation, but when you have an event of trauma, what starts happening to our minds and to our bodies? Because it's a lot.
There's a lot going on in your body, and the beautiful thing is, we were created, God created us so that we can manage the moment that we're in. So as an experience is unfolding where maybe we do feel that sense of like life or death, there's a threat. Again, it could be this, emotional threat or physical threat, but like our body will dump a bunch of chemicals so that we can have energy that we need to manage the current situation. And it will also shut off some things. So we'll get flooded with adrenaline. That's going to give us some energy. We're going to get the cortisol. And this kind of chemical dump will happen. And you kind of can notice this. Like, have you ever had those moments when you're driving and like someone, it looks like they're about to hit you and then they don't, and you're like, and that's your body getting flooded in that moment. So you just got a chemical dump in your body, so that you could kind of, and it allows you to just focus on the present moment. Typically when you're in that place, you're no longer thinking about, am I hungry? You might've been hungry 3 minutes ago, but that's gone. Am I in pain right now? That's gone. These are, there's kind of that stereotypical example of like, this is when the mom can lift the car off the baby, because again, her body is flooded with all these chemicals that allow her to do that. The other things that are good to know about is that your body also decides to shut some stuff down because it's not necessary for immediate survival and it needs the energy. So your digestive system is one of those things that will shut down or slow down. That's often why people who have either experienced a trauma or even people who have more of that cumulative trauma experience, they will often have digestive issues. Also, your ability to fight off illness, your immune system, that is also often shut down in that moment. So That's why you're more prone to colds, and like people get sick when they're stressed. It's because your body's putting all of its energy in other areas, and in imminent survival, it's not worrying about that. So you have less immunity going on for you. So there's all of this going on in the current moment, so that you can just stay really laser focused on like getting safe in that situation. The other thing that can happen is your body will also make a split second decision. So I've used the example sometimes. Well, even using your example, like you walk into that room where you realize, oh no, my friend is not okay. And your body has to make a split second decision about, what do I do right now? What's my best coping strategy in this situation? And for some situations, like let's say a bear showed up in this room and all of a sudden Kevin and I are like, oh my goodness, there's a bear in here. Our body's going to make a split second. Thank you. Split second decision and go, what's my play here? And it has a couple of options on the table. So it can go, I need to do flight. I need to get out of here, which with bears, I wouldn't recommend. But
if there's two people in a bear situation, you only have to outrun the other person. That's true. Not necessarily the bear.
But yeah, I've grown up.
I'll let the bear take me. You can run.
Thank you. That's so kind of you.
I mean, this is my home, so I should be a good host and sacrifice myself to the bear.
It's what Jesus would do, I think.
Right. Yeah.
So anyway, so flight. You could decide fight in that moment. Your body could go, you know what, we're gonna take this situation on, and try to manage it that way. You may freeze, and that's you'll even see animals will have this where you have like the fainting ghost where they just go down. So we don't have that dramatic of a freeze, but we will kind of just sort of shut down internally in the moment and just kind of go on autopilot, and that's us doing the freeze thing.
Just the example I just thought of is that in the last couple of years with the Me Too movement, you hear a lot of women being asked, well, why didn't you just get out of the room if Harvey Weinstein or whoever was making inappropriate advances? And the reaction of so many women is that they're just like, I froze. I didn't know what to do. And that's one of those split second things.
Yeah, because their best, and this is often true with sexual assault, is your best survival. Their body recognizes in that moment that our best survival strategy is actually to freeze. And then we just get through it. We take our mind will often kind of check out over here, and that way we can get through the situation, because fighting probably isn't going to work because of just factors involved. And that is a viable survival strategy. And so we've got fight, flight, freeze. And then the fourth one, you may not have heard of as much about.
I hadn't heard of this in this context.
This
is super interesting.
Yeah, I had just recently learned about it, and then kind of did some research to be like, is this real or is this like pop psychology? But the fourth one that we talk about now is fawn. And this one you'll see a lot, again, in abuse situations. Often this is where this one comes up, where your body recognizes my best survival strategy when I'm with maybe a person who is dangerous or who's bigger or more powerful than me is to placate and please. So I will do whatever it is that you ask me to do in this moment, because that is going to keep me the safest. I'm not going to fight you on this because that is going to be dangerous for me. So I'm going to be the best version of myself. I'm going to do everything that you want me to do.
And I mean, I've even been trained to do that in like retail context, or when I worked at Starbucks. Like, if an intruder comes in and is armed and says, "Give me your money," we just say, "Okay, here you go."
Yeah, because it's a survival strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's and each of these are valid. And a lot of times what can happen, and you'll hear, sexual assault victims actually are an example of this, is that sometimes people will feel like either other people are telling you should have done something, or you just feel like, people feel the most comfortable typically with fight, because it feels like, well, then I'm powerful and I'm doing something about this. There's actually a reason for that, because one of the big things we feel in trauma is powerlessness. And all those other responses can feel like powerlessness, where at least if I fought, I did something. But the reality is, you didn't even make a conscious decision in that moment. Your body was like, this is our best option. We're going for it. And so I think it's really helpful to know, because we can get so hard on ourselves for not having done these other things. When in reality, and this is often when I'm talking to people, I'll be like, oh my goodness, your body did exactly what you needed to do, what it needed to do to get you through that moment, so that you could survive.
And so now, having heard that, then thinking through my experience of when I found a friend, you know, in a near-death state, you know, it wasn't my near-death experience, but it was someone else's. And so I don't remember if I had like a stomach ache, but like I do remember just this like shot of adrenaline. Like suddenly I had tons of energy, and like I had been up late the night before, and I had just finished a work shift, and so it was night, and I was tired.
Yeah.
Or I had been tired up until that moment. That's something I was like, I'm awake. And that level of hyper focus was, when I look back on it, I'm like, I really was hyper focused because I was like, okay, have to call 911. Okay, they're here. Have to call their child. Have to be really calm when I call them and just lay it out simply and calmly. And then like when I was at the hospital shortly after the ambulance, and so I was like, okay, I have to keep it together because their kid is coming, and I have to be there for the kid. So your feelings get put in a box, and we'll deal with that later. And I was like hyper focused on that, and that helped me get through. And I thought it was helping me be there for that person.
Absolutely.
But it was also for myself.
Yeah, because you know, and I think that's a beautiful thing, is that God made our brains to kind of recognize like, okay, there's a lot going on in this moment, and I can't take it all in, because if I do, it will be too much. It will overwhelm my resources of coping. And so it kind of allows you to sort of put that stuff aside, kind of step to the side of it, and then stay functional in the moment. And do the things that need to get done. And thank goodness that you could be that person, you know, who could call all the people that need to get called, and your brain let you do that. And you couldn't have done that if you were getting hit with all the emotion of the situation. Like you couldn't have done that as easily.
Right.
And so it's like, yep, I can get through this. And the important thing is like our system, it's like a switch got flipped, right? You felt it. You felt the switch get flipped. And then it's just a matter of, then you have to have space to recover, and so that the switch can get flipped again, turned back off. But what can happen, either because of just, you know, our experiences, our genetic makeup sometimes even can make the switch harder to turn off. If the switch doesn't get turned off, I mean, you expended a lot of energy that night. And you got this chemical dump. Those chemicals need to get out of your body. Your nervous system needs to calm down. All these things need to be able to happen. And that stuff you put in the box over here, which was great in that moment, at some point, you know, kind of needs to get processed. And so that's the work afterwards. And sometimes if that doesn't happen, or you don't have a safe space to do that, I think this even is a way that our God has made us, is that sometimes because of our situations, we cannot safely do that for a while. And so it just kind of hangs out in the, you know, it's there in the closet, and it's going to stay there. And sometimes we get surprised because we'll get in a really good situation, and then it's like the stuff in the closet's like, hey, I'm here. Because it,
like, you're not, huh?
On some level, we kind of know like, oh, we could actually take this on now, and we couldn't back there. We just, it wasn't the right time. I didn't have people in my life that, you know, I didn't have support, whatever it was. And then the stuff that's hanging out in the closet is like, okay, we're going to probably show up now. And now I got to integrate all the stuff.
And like another piece that's interesting with like that adrenaline cortisol dump, it has to get out of your body somehow. And there's like 3 ways it does that. And I learned this after I had this experience. You either got to sweat it out, which a lot of people sweat in these kinds of stressful situations, cry it out, or maybe TMI, but you have to pee it out. And so like that day that I was in the hospital with my friend overnight and stuff, I was going to the bathroom a lot. I was like, what is going on? I haven't had an unusual amount of water. Like, what is going on? And then like the next day I learned, oh, stress peeing is a thing. So I was like, oh, that makes more sense now.
And a lot of times, you know, if you can't do anything else, you know, like, because some of us have jobs where we're exposed to more trauma, and it's like, I can't just sit and like write in my journal right now about it. But the one thing I can do for myself is I can drink a bunch of water. I can go for a run after work, because that is going to help get those chemicals out of my body so that my nervous system can settle, because we need that.
Well, and like I didn't get much sleep that night overnight in the hospital.
Right.
And then the next several days, like it took me several days of getting extra sleep before I felt fully rested again, even though it was just one night that I didn't get as much sleep as normal. It took days because it threw off my body so much.
Because your body expended so much energy dealing with the situation that night that even if you'd gotten your normal sleep, but you didn't, but even if you'd gotten that, it probably would have still taken you a couple days. And a lot of us really underestimate, I think, the fact that our body needs recovery time after stuff.
Yes.
And we just kind of try to push through it. And again, I think it can feel, especially I think in Christian circles, it can feel like that's what maybe I'm supposed to, or I should be able to handle this. But again, God made our body with limits. Jesus modeled that our bodies have limits in his own ministry.
Yes.
And so we have to honor those. Like we have to honor the way that we were made. And the reality is that you're going to need a few days, you know, and you're going to have to kind of take care of yourself in that process to help give your body the chance to recover and be ready for you the next time you need it.
Absolutely. So then that's kind of what happens to our bodies in the moment of you're experiencing the trauma. Here's what happens while it's happening. Here's how your brain and your body get you through the moment.
Yeah.
What happens later down the road when you start manifesting any sort of symptoms of trauma? It may be it may be relatively small symptoms, and it may range all the way to severe PTSD.
Yeah.
What's that look like?
Yeah. So it can be things like symptoms are around the idea of avoidance. So, you know, using a car example, and I will see this often with car accidents actually, where people are a little bit hesitant either to get back in the car, or it's like, I'm fine getting in the car, but I want to drive past that street that I had the accident on. So it's kind of because I'm afraid of what it's going to feel like or what it's going to trigger for me, like these symptoms that are going to maybe feel overwhelming. So I'm going to feel scared or anxious. I'm going to get that adrenaline jump again. And so then people will start to avoid things. And the problem with avoidance, especially when it's avoiding things that make us anxious, is that it only makes us more anxious of the thing.
Yeah.
And so then it even creates, you know, more of a cycle of, you know, then I get anxious if I'm anywhere near it, and then it starts to impact our functioning, right? I can't ever drive on that street, or worse, I can't drive my car anymore. Like, so you're looking for avoidance. Sometimes it's just things that are like memories that you associated with the car. So whenever I see a red car, because the car that hit me was red, now I get sort of anxious around that, or I'm stressful. And
what can that anxiousness, how can that manifest?
So it can be, again, just... I think a lot of times it can be physiological, where it's like you're feeling shaky, or you get out of breath, cold, your heart is beating really fast. All that kind of stuff can be part of it.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a great question. But yeah, I think a lot of those kinds of symptoms can happen. And so, or, you know, I avoid talking about the thing because I'm afraid even of talking about it will kind of bring it. And so more and more things can start to feel sort of tainted by this experience. And then the more that happens, the more it impacts functioning. So that's one of the categories. The other one, I think, besides avoidance, is just those physiological things. So maybe you start having nightmares about the situation. So you're not sleeping well. You can have an experience, and this one is one that feels really scary when you're in it, where it's like all of a sudden I feel in this moment exactly like I did when that thing was happening.
Yeah.
And it hits you, and your body, again, will have a lot of those physiological symptoms often. And it can feel so overwhelming when it happens. And it can make you, if you've never experienced it before, sometimes you're like, am I going crazy right now? Because it feels very overwhelming in that moment. And so that's another one that can happen, which again then can lead to avoidance. Some people too, if it's been a big enough thing, it really can alter your perspective on the world and like question things that you held without question before. Like whether it's as simple as the world is a safe place, or God is good, or, you know, it's like, okay, well, this thing just happened. How do I make sense of that? Like,
well, and that's what the country grappled with after 9/11. You know, we thought we were safe on our airplanes or whatever.
Yeah.
And suddenly now we're like, oh, we're not as safe as we thought.
Yeah. Yeah. And you even think about, like, on a small level, like, I've gotten to the point where if I go to the store now, and this is so tiny, but like it used to be that I just expected, like, if I wanted this brand of apples, that brand of apples was going to be there.
Yeah.
Since the pandemic and all the shipping and all the whatever, it's like, it's like hit or miss whether it'll be there. And I always have a little of anxiety if it's something I really want, or need.
Yeah.
It's like, will it be there? Like, so it can start to shift our perspective. And on the one hand, it can really help us ask important questions about our faith, about who God is, on the other hand, it can also scare us or make us, like we can reevaluate our faith and our beliefs about the world in pretty profound ways. Mm-hmm. And those things are harder to even notice. There can also be relational things where, like, because maybe I get more irritable because I'm dealing with this kind of anxiety or things like that. And then you and I can be talking and I'm like, wow, you don't really get how the world works because you've never been through anything hard, obviously.
Right.
And so now I feel like I can't connect with you because I don't think you're going to get it maybe, or you wouldn't understand what I'm going through. And so then it creates even a relational disconnect sometimes.
Yeah. And so one of the things you mentioned was that over time, these symptoms can progress to the point where they're hindering daily life and hindering your function. Is that the point? Because a lot of times, a lot of us have been through some sort of trauma and maybe not dealt with it specifically because, we maybe had some symptoms, but they weren't consistent. They didn't stick around long enough to inhibit function. At what point should a person say, something traumatic has happened to me and I should get help with this? Yeah,
I think it really is if it's impacting functioning, and especially if it impacts functioning for longer than, I would say, like, for sure longer than a month, because you're going to expect to see it impact your functioning for a little while when something major has happened. And I even give a caveat with that because, like, if let's say you lost someone in a profound way, obviously in a month, you're still not going to be functioning the way you were before the thing happened. You may never function the way you did before the thing happened. So that's not what we're going for. But if you're like, I'm not sleeping, I'm having nightmares, or I'm having these flashes of, these moments where I feel like I'm back in that experience and it's been longer than a month, it might be worth having a conversation with somebody. Because I think a lot of times, like you said, we all go through this stuff. And the big things when I'm meeting with someone, I want to know, like, what was your support system like? And a lot of times I'll ask them, like, who did you tell about this and how did they respond? Yeah. Because that is so powerful.
Yes.
So I worked with someone, and I'm going to do lots of evading as far as who, but there was a person in the past that I had worked with who had been a missionary, and it had been in frontline situations, in some really intense situations. Never had heard of trauma.
Frontline, like battle?
Like, yeah. So it was like, there's stuff going on. And even though they were doing more humanitarian types of things.
They're still present in that area.
Yes, they were still seeing the things.
Yep.
And so when they first started having symptoms, again, they were believers. So it was like, what's going on with me? And then they had reached out to some people that should have been their support system. And the support system basically said, this is a defect of your character that you're having these responses. Ugh. So that was like a trauma times two.
Yeah.
So because a lot of times if we have safe, supportive people that we can go to and talk about these experiences, and they are there to listen and validate and acknowledge, we can do a lot of that processing with them. But when we don't have that, that becomes a problem, and it's harder to cope. And then B, certain situations, even with great support, you're still going to have responses that linger, or and you're going to need maybe some additional tools. So I think when you're, past that 30 days point, and it's not just like, I'm not the person I was before, but like, I can't eat and sleep and go to work the way that I would like to right now, even if you're not fully present, but you're able to do this. Like, those are times when I would talk to somebody.
Yeah. And I guess applying some of these things to the experience I had, thankfully, I didn't manifest a lot of like trauma symptoms, and certainly nothing long term. But for a few days at work, I was just really distracted.
Yes,
Thankfully
totally
I worked
normal.
retail, and so it wasn't like anybody's life was on the line at work. So I was like, so that was fine. I can be distracted and also help someone search for the correct size. But I also noticed because my friend was first brought to Fairview Ridges Hospital, for anybody who's familiar with Burnsville. Okay. It's now called M Health something, I don't know.
M Health Fairview probably.
Yeah. But so that hospital was where my friend was brought to the ER, and for the next week I had to drive by that, and every time I drove by I just got such high anxiety when I got close to the hospital, and just even seeing the hospital, even though I didn't like see the parking lot that I parked in or see the doors, just knowing that I was close to that where it happened. Yeah. My heart just started and I couldn't breathe, and I just noticed over the week that reaction gradually lessened over time as I got more well rested. Yes. And
that's what we want to see. I mean, that's what I would be looking for. If you and I had been, meeting during that time for some reason, I would, that was what I would want to see, because that's really normal response to an abnormal event, but it went down over time. And you did the thing that's hard to do, which is you kind of let yourself go there and feel that. So you drove by the hospital, even though sometimes it's I want to avoid that feeling, and so I'll just avoid the hospital. Yeah. But the best way actually to help that response go down was actually what you did, which is to drive by. Yeah. You experience this stuff, you kind of breathe your way through it. Yeah. And then over time it will start to go down.
Which, if I had known that I was going to react that way, I might not have driven by. I didn't know I was going to feel that at all, because I was like, okay, everything's fine now. My friend's in a good place. Yeah. They're getting the help they need. It's all good. I had no idea when I got on the road that day that driving by was going to be a thing.
Yeah, and absolutely.
I might have taken a longer, more circuitous route if I had realized that.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes, that will happen. And that's why, too, I think the sooner that you go in to talk to somebody, even if you just go in once or twice, you may not have full-blown trauma, but sometimes, in a situation like that, let's say that, you drove by that first time and you're like, yikes, that was a lot. Yeah. I don't want to deal with that. And so then you started kind of avoiding a little bit. If you'd met with someone, they could have been like, hey, I noticed that let's have you drive there, but maybe have someone else drive you. And so that you can just be with someone, they'll know what's going on, but they can just be with you so that you can kind of, do it in a slightly less anxiety-provoking way, but still kind of approach it. Right. So that we can work your way down.
Into it.
Yes.
Yep.
Because otherwise, it's so tempting to want to and it's okay if the first day, you don't drive by it. Nobody's saying you have to push yourself to the max. Again, you just want to take baby steps towards reintegrating those pieces of your life back in so that you don't lose freedom. Yeah. Because that's what can happen, is the anxiety can start to build, and then you start to lose pieces of freedom and functionality. Yeah. And again, it's the way our brains were designed. So they're I don't want to experience, that was painful and hard and overwhelming. Yeah. And what it will do then, our brain it will kind of scan for everything that it sort of can attach to that experience that sets off warning lights. So it knows, hey, when I'm in a situation like this is what I should be looking for. But our brains can get so specific where it's okay, now it's the hospital, right?
Right.
And now it's I don't even want to be around the hospital, and it can start to pick out all these different things that are connected to it. A really good example is why this is really helpful is, let's say when you're a little kid and you touch the stove and it's hot, it's your brain kind of goes, okay, nope, don't, that hot, bad, don't touch it, And that's a really adaptive thing for us to be able to, our brains to do, is to learn to learn from pain.
Yeah.
But if you're, the problem would be what if you then were oh, I don't ever, actually ovens altogether are scary. Or you know what, now actually the kitchen, I don't even want to be in the kitchen because that's where the oven with the hot burner is. Then you start to lose functioning. Yep. So you want to be able to kind of be specific, and our brains like to generalize.
Yes. Well, as you were talking, I just kind of thought of my mom, because when she was, I don't know, some pretty young, in grade school or something, she got a chipped tooth. And so she had to go to the dentist and get it drilled, and they didn't use anesthesia or Novocaine or something, and so like it was just really painful, and so she just associated
terrible.
the sound of drilling with a really bad dental experience.
Absolutely.
Which is hilarious because my dad works in construction. So like just anytime she heard drilling, part of her was just kind of like, ugh.
Yeah.
And like part of her also wants to avoid going to the dentist. She knows she has to.
Yeah.
And she does. And
Yeah.
it's hilarious because she's like, I shouldn't share it. That's maybe she wouldn't want me sharing that. But it's funny. It's fine.
Yeah,
She's good. She still goes to the dentist, but she doesn't like it.
Yeah.
She really doesn't like it because she had that one bad experience with the dentist as a kid.
And my guess is that there's some chemical stuff happening when she goes in, and even though she's going in, which is good, she's not totally avoiding it. She's avoiding it with discomfort. And some of us, and I think, again, I can see this with Christians often, is that we might not avoid, but we're still doing things in a high level of misery. And, so it's like I'm white knuckling my way through this situation. And again, we talked about this last week, but like there are times where there might be tools on hand that would allow you to not have to white knuckle it.
Yeah.
So yes, you're functioning, but you're functioning with your knuckles white and your face pale, and and it's like it's taking so much out of your body and your resources to get through that situation, when there might be some tools that help you. And not to say that that's what your mom used to do, but I think that's such a great example of like, I just see that a lot, because I don't think I said this totally in the last week, but primarily my work has been in Christian contexts. So I feel like that's one of those places where I will see, like, no, you're still functioning, but you're functioning with such a high level of pain that we might be able to make it so that you can function with more joy, with more fullness, and less pain. Mm-hmm. Your pain tolerance is amazing, but maybe we don't have to
Not everything has to be pushed to that limit.
Yes.
Yeah. So another question that is kind of really interesting is that adults and kids experience trauma very differently. And certainly kids' brains are in a constant adult brains are always developing too, but especially kids' brains are developing. So what are some of the different ways that adults and children experience trauma differently? Yeah,
so we've talked about some of the things that adults experience, whether it's like, the physiological symptoms, the tendency maybe to avoid, the ways that it can shape their worldview. Like you said, because they're doing a lot of brain and body development. So trauma can impact them on some fundamental levels, but often the way that their symptoms come out is through behavior. So that is the golden ticket, is if you see your kid behaving in a dramatically different way, or you notice like, wow, they've always been this way and all of a sudden that's shifted, like it's really worth getting to the bottom of that. Like, what is going on? Why has there been such a behavioral shift? The other thing you can see with kids is they'll be more clingy. They'll regress developmental stages, very common. So, your child who was, fully potty trained, not a bedwetter, all of a sudden is wetting the bed again. Super normal and common. I'm trying to think of some other things, but I think, again, they'll also want to avoid, like, our brains are like, let's not do pain if we don't have to.
Yep.
So, you have the kiddo who stops going to school, or they no longer want to go to so-and-so's house.
Yeah.
They start exhibiting all this kind of anxiety around going over to so-and-so's house. Like, you want to get to the bottom of what that's about, because that could be very telling. Or maybe they're not eating, or, so you really want to pay attention to behavior changes, because they can't tell you like, hey, I'm feeling really overwhelmed because this, and they don't have all the language. And that's the other big thing, is they don't have language to tell you how they're feeling. I mean, sometimes even as adults, we don't have good language. So you can imagine what a kiddo has on. So they're really needing us as adults to kind of recognize, wow, your behavior seems really different, or you seem to really be activated by this thing, or you get really upset when you see this thing. You gotta kind of, it's like a puzzle box, and you kind of gotta put the pieces together and figure out what's going on.
Yeah. And I even noticed that on such small scales, like, if one of my nieces or nephews like has a bad experience with something,
Yeah.
they don't want to do it again. Like, no. Like, no, I fell off my bike once. I don't want to ever get on it again. And it's like, okay, I don't want to push them onto it immediately, but like also I want to say, you can do this. You can learn this skill.
Yeah.
But I also want to recognize, you had a hard time with that last time.
Yeah, and then you got to kind of do the taking it a little bit at a time thing again. I think the other thing that sometimes adults miss about kids is that kids are often far more aware than we give them credit for. They know when stuff is going down, even if you're not talking to them about it. And I have been floored at times at what kids, they'll tell you through their drawings, they'll tell you, they'll on so many levels, they'll tell you, I know what's happening.
Yeah.
You can even with babies, you will have babies, like if their parents have been through something traumatic or something, even their behavior, their pattern of crying, their cleanliness will change. And so even at a really tiny age, you're still getting changes in behavior. So I think that's just the golden ticket is like, what's, why is this behavior change happening? When is it happening? And often, a lot of trauma work is figuring out what are kind of the triggers that we maybe are and aren't aware of, and then learning how to calm our nervous system down when we hit those triggers, so that they no longer overpower and our body doesn't go into, this is a serious threat.
Right.
Anymore, because we don't need that response anymore.
Right. And then we kind of touched a little bit on this, but like, what's the difference between, or is there a possibility of having like collective trauma versus like individual trauma? And so collective being like a family or a nation, like I mentioned COVID, what are some of those dynamics look like?
Yeah, I think there absolutely is. And you'll see it like, I think as different, whether it's countries or families, I've spent some time in the Middle East and seeing how different war experiences or, the rise of different groups and the impact that has on people. Like you will see I think about like Ukraine right now.
Yes.
Where Ukraine is in a collective trauma.
Yes.
Because even if you're not living in a town that's being directly impacted by the war, you probably have family members who are. You're watching it on the news. Somebody is affected, and it's your country and your home and so they're going through a collective trauma, and that collective trauma is going to shape a lot of things for them, whether it's just physiological responses that they now have to different things, to how they view the world, to how they understand the world. Like all of those things are going to be shaped by this thing that everyone's now granted, it's going to shape different people in different ways based on things we've talked about, but it would be pretty hard to walk through that situation and not be shaped at all.
Right.
And I think COVID is the same way, right? For most of us, it was this hugely disruptive moment. And, whether you lost your job or you worked from home or you had to homeschool or you had family members that got sick or, maybe even passed away from COVID, like we've all on some level dealt with the realities of COVID in our lives. Granted, how that shakes out for each one of us will look different, but it will shape us as a community in certain ways because we've walked through that experience.
Yeah. Well, I also think of like the experience of people of color and experiencing racism.
Yes.
Like that's a form of collective trauma.
Absolutely.
So like, even though like something like George Floyd, in theory, it's only traumatic to his immediate family and friends that lost him, it's collectively traumatic to
Absolutely.
a lot of people.
Because because it's like, this is a reminder that I'm not safe.
Right.
This person represents my brother, my nephew, my cousin, stories I have heard, experiences that I've had personally. All of those come into play. And there's so many of those stories that are, George Floyd is a big one, but there's so many more that happened before and since. So, this moment happens and all those other traumas also come back and are impacting you in that moment. And that's the other thing is, trauma can be a bit cumulative, like sort of like grief can be cumulative. So how I experience this trauma, we've sort of hit on this, but is going to be shaped by the other traumas I've experienced. Yeah. And a big thing honestly that happens that can impact our ability to process trauma is whether it's acknowledged.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at something like that, it's like, do people even acknowledge that that was a traumatic event, or that was shouldn't have happened, or whatever? And I've seen examples of things where people are unwilling to acknowledge. Sometimes that happens with wars or, genocide, where it's like, if it's never officially acknowledged, like that wound just kind of, it's like, it's really hard to find healing when we can't even name
Agreed.
it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. There's a lot with that.
So much with that. We're probably not even the best people to.
Well, then getting towards the end, one of the final couple of questions I have is, how do you identify and process trauma? So, I mean, there may be things that you can point to in your life that you're like, okay, clearly that was a trauma because I reacted in these ways to it. And you may or may not have come through that in a healthy way. But if you're looking back on your life and saying, was that trauma? Was that an accumulation of events that add up to trauma? So how do you identify that? And then how do you process a trauma in a healthy way, whether it's something that just happened or something that you recognized happened years ago and it still has residual impacts on you?
I think, a lot of it has to do with, how did I perceive that event? So I think as you're looking back going, were there experiences I had that were pretty overwhelming that I really didn't know what to do with at the time, or I didn't really have anywhere I could go with it, like that maybe are still shaping, how I see the world, or I'm noticing that I have some responses. Sometimes our responses are just, I get really irritable with people when they respond in a certain way to me. Could that be connected to something I've experienced in the past? So I think just looking at those things, or even just recognizing, like, do I see patterns where I continue to find myself freezing in situations where I don't maybe necessarily need to, but it's sort of, my body sort of responds that way. Or I'm in that sort of fawn position where if someone's an authority, I tend to just do whatever they want. Like, do I notice patterns of that? Because maybe that's an indicator light, a warning light. Do I have physiological symptoms that pop up, maybe in situations that I'm like, well, when I think about it, that, I am always nervous when a car comes at me from the right side, and that's a minor example because most of us, that doesn't significantly impact functioning. But, it's just recognizing, like, are there patterns of things that are continue to pop up in my life that might be connected to something in the past? Maybe I do need to look at that.
Yeah.
I think that's, looking at those things.
And that doesn't mean you have something as severe as PTSD.
No. PTSD is actually not the most common mental health issue you would have. Most common actually is just anxiety, or maybe even a specific phobia. So again, like hospitals, I don't ever go in hospitals again, because that's actually the most common. We talk about PTSD a lot, because we started understanding trauma through the eyes of veterans. That's kind of how trauma started to be understood. And, we started with the after effects of war. So, so that we just got to know it through that lens. But there's many other things that could be playing out for you that I think just, could be worth looking at and going, even on a small level, even if I don't have full-blown PTSD, but I just recognize patterns in my life that seem to have maybe stemmed or from this situation. It's probably not a bad idea to talk to somebody and, and I think as far as starting that process, it could be as simple as journaling, or, even what to do after a trauma. I mean, first of all, super basic, like do the cry, pee, drink water, sweat, like just get the chemicals out of your body. The second thing I think is to be able to process with somebody. It doesn't have to be a therapist, but just who's your support system. You need to reach out to them. You need to talk about the stuff. The more you don't want to probably talk about something is likely the more you need to talk about it. So it's like, I feel like I was a failure. I should have handled this better. Stuff you feel shame around about that comes up in the situation, or, like any of that, you want to expose that to the healing light of sunlight and validation, empathy. Like when you can put that in front of somebody and they can meet you with validation and empathy, it can do a lot to take away some of the burden that you might be carrying after a traumatic experience. And then just doing things like taking care of yourself, get more sleep,
Yep.
keep a little bit of a schedule, because that can help. And with kids, schedules are amazing.
Yes.
They really do well with that. But even for you, like it doesn't have to be rigid. There can be some wiggle room, but just, I'm going to get up at the same time every day. I'm going to go to bed at the same time every day. I'm going to put on clothes, like whatever that is. And then I think, you mentioned this too, how you were a little bit distracted in the early days. So really simple, practical thing is like write stuff down.
Yes.
Like in your phone, on a calendar, whatever. Just your brain is not going to be able to hold as much because it is processing.
Yeah.
So little detail crap, it doesn't care about right then.
Yeah.
So just write it down, and that way you have it, and that you don't have to think so hard because you're doing a lot. And I think just being kind to yourself in those first days and recognizing if you're having some of those symptoms, just let them come. Don't avoid them or try to run away from them, because just like you did sort of accidentally, but like it's almost like you just have to work it through.
Yes.
And then it will start to come down, and then you're going to be okay. Like, granted, like I said, sometimes stuff happens and we need a little bit of extra support. And then I think counseling, there's some specific trauma work that people can do that has amazing effects on, if it feels like, wow, this is really taking over. I can't sleep at night, or I just have so many of these experiences where I feel like I'm back in that moment. Or another one, I forgot to talk about this one, but hypervigilance is a big one. So like that constant, like being on edge, looking for danger all the time, that's exhausting.
Oh yeah.
'Cause like you said, you were in that hyper state of alert. That happens, often when we're in, and again, if that doesn't click off, like being that on that level of alert is so tiring.
Yeah.
Like, so you need to be able to, so if that's not happening, there's things that can be done for your sleep. There's things that can be done to help you manage memories that are maybe just having too much power in your life. Like there's some really great therapies out there that are specifically for people who've gone through trauma.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to reach out to those.
Yeah. Well, and you can, like, I think of an event like a car accident, you may not even be the person who was in the cars that were affected.
Right.
But if you're on the scene and you see some really grisly, gruesome, whatever injuries, that can be a form of trauma.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, first responders often experience a ton of trauma because they are seeing stuff. And even though it's not them or even someone they know, that's still hard. And I said this to you before, but the way I like to think about trauma is, especially the symptoms of trauma, is that we are living in a world that is broken and not right.
Yes.
And trauma is evidence of that. And our symptoms of trauma are almost like our bodies agreeing, like what just happened was not what I was designed for. It's not what this was supposed to be about. And so what happened is not okay. It's not right. The world is not right.
Right.
And it's almost like our trauma symptoms are agreeing with God that like this thing was not okay.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we are working so hard to like spiritualize and be like, I should be okay through this, when in reality, like, this wasn't okay.
No.
Like
God is not okay with this either. Like,
no. And so
God talks about these situations in the Bible as being horrible.
Right. Yeah, and I always go back to Romans where it talks about the groaning passage, because we always jump to all things work together.
Yes.
But what we miss is the whole section before.
Oh, yeah.
Where it talks about the creation is groaning. The Holy Spirit is groaning on our behalf in words that aren't even words. Like, that is, so Paul is validating our reality before he ever gets to
God works through them.
And I think we just jump
Yep.
out of our own anxiety to like that part, when in reality, like, the groaning is real.
Oh, yes, it is.
And trauma, I think, is often just, that is us groaning about the brokenness of the world.
Yeah. And it's so important for us to recognize that, because if we're not acknowledging what trauma is and what trauma does, that's going to hinder our discipleship.
Absolutely.
If we're not validating people's experiences, that creates a wall, that closes the door to say, okay, I can't talk to that person because, and even though, like, certainly you don't understand every aspect of a person's experience, but like you can be there for them.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like to experience a miscarriage, but I can sit there with someone and listen to someone who's experienced that.
Absolutely. And the reality is that there have already been many people who have left church and walked out the church door because they scanned the room, and through conversations or just how things were talked about, they're like, I cannot share this real thing that I've walked through because no one's going to understand or get it, or they're going to jump to the fix and not sit with me in the groaning.
Yep.
And I know that because I've sat with them on the other side where they already had walked out church doors, and they're sitting in my office talking through this stuff and being like, and sometimes it's out of like, I feel like I'm protecting them from knowing how bad the world is, but it's really sad because I want our churches to be spaces where it's safe to be real about what we've walked through and for it to be healing. I think that's what Jesus would want, but we have sometimes missed the mark. And that's why I like doing these conversations, because I think if we can do that better, we are going to disciple people better.
Yeah. Well, and Jesus himself says, like, I came here for the people who are sick, who need healing. And, like, that's absolutely about mental health in part,
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I talked about this in a previous episode with Anna, but, like, sometimes what is phrased as demonization in the Bible might be considered mental illness today. Right. We can't necessarily make that conclusion, but like these kinds of issues have been persistent throughout history.
Yes.
And God absolutely wants to be there with us through these things. And like we've emphasized before, prayer is always an important part of this. But there are additional tools that God is providing us for us and saying, this tool is an answer to the prayer that you're praying right now. Sometimes we just want the snap fix. Yeah. But that's not always how it works.
Yeah. And, sometimes God chooses to work that way, but, more often than not, it is sort of the slow process of healing. Just like, he doesn't, he often, instead of doing the quick fix, has us walk through a process. And, I don't know, why he chooses to do it one way sometimes and, the other way other times. But I know that more often than not, it is more the slow process. Yeah. And that he wants to meet us in that.
Yeah. Well, and just suddenly, just as you were saying that, like, Jesus is our fix. Jesus will come and heal all things. But even that wasn't a quick fix, because he was alive for 33 years, they estimate. So, like, that's a 33-year solution. Yeah. That's not a quick fix. I mean, there's just so many things in the Bible that are not quick fixes. And mental health is part of that. Yeah. Trauma is part of that. Yeah. And I don't want to say we have to be okay with that, because there's nothing okay about some of these experiences. But we have to accept that that's the reality of them. They take time, they take effort, and it's hard. Yeah. But we have to acknowledge that, or else we're not going to disciple well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, is if we can just have some of this basic knowledge of mental health, the resources, all the things that you've been doing in the past 5 weeks, I think we can disciple better. Our own relationship with God can grow and develop and deepen as we start to understand how other things might be shaping but also we can be present for people and in ways that are healing and powerful, when we can acknowledge the reality of trauma, when we can acknowledge the reality of how hard the struggle with mental health can be. Like, when we can sit with people in those spaces, we can help them see the presence of God. Yes. And I think that's the power of it.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a very wide-ranging conversation, and there's so much more depth we could get into on all of these aspects. But I'm really thankful for you for watching or listening into these conversations about mental health, because historically they've just not happened enough in the church. And so I'm really thankful for you for participating in that. I'm thankful to Anna Gryzka for her contributions to the previous 3 episodes, and I'm thankful to Lisa Wold here for her contribution to these 2 episodes, and just an open invite. If you ever want to come back and talk about anything mental health related, just let me know and we'll throw in an episode. But
yeah, absolutely.
We'll definitely be, I'm sure, talking about mental health in future episodes as well. But for now, we are done with the mental health series for the moment. But again, I'm sure at some point we'll address it again in some way. But thanks again, Lisa.
Yeah,
thank you all for being a part of this. Make sure you subscribe on whatever platform you're watching or listening to. And as always, have a wonderful day.
Thank you.